Hey everyone, it's Andrea of Gaslit Nation. I'm about to play a recording of a video discussion from 2024 September for the graphic novel In the Shadow of Stalin, The Story of Mr. Jones. I cut some portions because they're very visual, but if you want to watch, which I highly recommend you do because it takes you inside this incredible story based on history, you can find the video in the show notes. And thank you to everyone who is staying engaged and raising their voices and doing everything they can for Ukraine in this existential battle for the survival of this country and for international law and against the terrorist state of Russian fascism that has destabilized so many countries around the world, including, of course, our own here in the United States. So Ukraine, as we've always said on Gaslit Nation since the launch of the show, is the battleground of democracy versus fascism.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Holodomor hot off the press tonight, which highlights recently published historical fiction about the Holodomor. My name is Anastasia Odinovich. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Florida, and I work primarily in comparative children's literature, comics, and visual studies, with a focus on how works of popular culture depict intergenerational memory and trauma. I'm the editor of Image Text, Interdisciplinary Comic Studies at the University of Florida, and the book reviews co-editor of The Lion and the Unicorn, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. My first book, Second Generation Memory in Contemporary Children's Literature, Ghost Images, received the Children's Literature Association Book Award in 2015. Rec Ed in Toronto welcomes you from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, which is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, with whom we are grateful to share this land. Tonight, I will introduce our author and discuss a few questions with her about her recently published graphic novel, In the Shadow of Stalin, The Story of Mr. Jones. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Andrea Holupa, who is from Brooklyn, New York, where she is a journalist and filmmaker. She is the host and producer of the Webby Award honoree civic action podcast, Gaslit Nation, where she addresses the threat of fascism globally. She's the writer-producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, directed by three-time Academy Award nominee Agnieszka Holland, starring James Norton, Vanessa Kirby, and Peter Sarsgaard. And we hope that many of you have seen this film. She studied Soviet history at the University of California, Davis, and Ukrainian at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. She is the author of the graphic novels Orwell and the Refugees, The Untold Story of Animal Farm, and Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think. She wrote and directed the short documentary, The Holodomor, Stalin's Secret Genocide, shown at the United Nations in 2016. She has spoken at the Council of Europe, the National Press Club, the National Arts Club, a committee room at the House of Lords, and universities in the US, Canada, Europe, and the Middle East. Her commitment to human rights was inspired by her parents, born in the European displaced persons camp after World War II. She delves into this personal history in her book, Orwell and the Refugees, The Untold Story of Animal Farm. And with that, I'd like to welcome author Andrea Holupa.
I want to first thank Valentina Coriul of HREC, the founder and the queen of HREC. This book would not exist if it were not for her. This was her brainchild to do some sort of graphic novel, and I'm very grateful for all the trust and faith and hard work that she put into the existence of this important book that we hope will reach a lot of students of all ages around the world.
Could you tell us a little bit more about Gareth Jones for those who might just not be as familiar with his life, and how you became interested in his story, how you started to research his story?
Gareth Jones, if you go back to that page, or he's asking for directions and saying Husovka, Stalino, he's asking for directions from the train station. That Husovka is significant because that's how Gareth ended up a hero of Ukraine. He grew up in a port city in Wales, Barry, Wales. I visited his childhood home. From his childhood bedroom, he could see the sea stretched out before him. He could walk down to the docks and see all the ships from sailors around the world. So that's a dream childhood, to have that sense of like a giant runway that he could just fly and take off of, like, right in his own backyard. And so he was somebody that had big dreams of seeing the world. The sort of hero in his life that facilitated that was his mother, who, as a young woman, broke with convention herself by being a young governess English teacher for the great Welsh industrialist John Hughes, who founded Donetsk, which was Husovka. And so Gareth grew up with her stories of living on the edge of the earth. And so for Gareth Jones, Ukraine was mom. And so he had been there 3 times and he had a lot of affection for the country. He was not blindly obedient to all things Ukrainian. Like, he was pretty critical, hyper vigilant of what he saw as Ukraine nationalism. It was a time of rising nationalism around the world, like today, but he felt a sense of affection, very much so, for that country, and felt an obligation. And when he came out with his famine reporting, it was just so meticulous, and that's how he was described. I want to make clear to everyone that this was a young man that lived a life that most would dream of. Like, he was in the front seat of watching history unfold. He was brilliant at Cambridge, learning all these different languages. He took an assignment in New York City for a powerhouse publicist, and he would wander up to Harlem, to the Black churches, watch these women singing Black spirituals, and he would go to the shanty towns of the Great Depression, witness the famine of the Great Depression in America. He wandered onto the lawn of the White House and photobombed a portrait with President Hoover that was being taken at the White House. He had a sense of humor, and he talked his way. He used his charm. He charmed Hitler's piano player, this German American who was quite a doofus, infamous doofus, who was sort of Hitler's one of Hitler's earliest lackeys, who worked as sort of like a press gatekeeper to get all the propagandists to sing Hitler's praises. And Gareth basically convinced this man to let him on a flight with Hitler traveling across Germany. And Gareth got a big story out of that. And he opened that article with the famous words, "If this airplane should crash, all of Europe would be changed." And he was absolutely correct. And not many people saw that at that time. And I think it's important to know about the Gareth Jones story is the reason why he was just ahead of his time, for seeing that he didn't have to choose at that moment, Gareth versus Stalin. He saw the danger in both. That's why he was risking his life to get into the lion's den with both. He reported on Hitler saying these were primal rallies, that the energy in Hitler's rallies were primal. With Stalin, he called out the useful idiots of Moscow. He called out Eugene Lyons, who we saw, Eugene Lyons of UPI. And that scene, I shared that tonight because in that scene, we're meeting Eugene Lyons, who had a luxurious life in Moscow, like so many did of the Western press that turned a blind eye. It wasn't just Duranty. Duranty was the most aggressive with publishing Soviet propaganda in the New York Times, but he had help. It was all the conformists in the Western press at the time that backed up Duranty. Duranty couldn't have gotten away with what he did if it wasn't for them. That's why I give Eugene Lyons his place in the story as well. And he's significant because he understood that with Gareth's brave reporting, the party was over. And it was only a matter of time that history would catch up to them. And I always saw Gareth, from all my research into him, like reading his letters that he wrote home to his mom and dad when he was going on all these great adventures, being so defiant and forging his own independent destiny, being this fearless, independent spirit. I always saw in Gareth this cowboy with this swagger coming to town and not manipulating, not tricking everyone, but almost like the, Detective Columbo. He came across as so nerdy and meticulous that he could just have his way with people. He was smarter than all of them. And that's how he was able to do what he did. But he had such a good heart. And I think he knew the price he'd ultimately pay. I don't think he was shocked. I don't think he was naive. I think he just did the right thing because that's how he was raised. That was his mother and father were upstanding. They were both very active in a local church that produced a lot of graduates that would go on to Cambridge. So he had this upstanding moral streak in him. So he understood the price of truth. And that's the name of the film in Ukraine. So I can go on and on about what an extraordinary person he is. So you're going to have to cut me off. But I'll say one final point. Eugene Lyons is significant in this story because he would write a tell-all to clear his conscience and to cash in on the fact that the tide was sort of turning. Gareth's reporting was giving courage to others to come forward. He wrote a book called Assignment in Utopia, and there's a brilliant, chilling chapter in that book called The Western Press Conceals a Famine. And in it, he describes how all the fancy journalists of the day were gathered together in a suite in the Metropole Hotel, which we saw. They brokered a deal with the chief Soviet censor to go back to their articles and write that Gareth Jones is lying. And in exchange, they'd get access to the big, scandalous story of the Kremlin taking hostage 6 British engineers, who you also met in that scene. And that's what the Kremlin does today. Taking hostage a WNBA player, taking hostage a Wall Street Journal reporter. That's what they did back then. That's what they do today to blackmail the West, to try to spread their terror, their imperialist aims. They did it back then under Stalin. And so those scenes of history repeating and all these primary sources of these journalists giving voice to all this, it's just ringing in my ears as all these current events are unfolding.
The story is fascinating, and as you say, it's so relevant to our own contemporary moment. Of course, this is a story that you've told before. You were the screenwriter for the film Mr. Jones that was directed by 3-time Oscar nominee Agnieszka Holland. What motivated you to adapt this narrative into comics form? What do comics or graphic novels do that the medium of film may not?
Well, that's such a great question. So I was determined to get this story out in any way, shape, or form. My grandfather was born and raised in Donbass. He grew up thinking in Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian, writing in Ukrainian, because Donbass, of course, was a hotbed of Ukrainian national identity before the famine, certainly. So I wanted to make a monument to pay tribute to him. I wanted to be close to my grandpa, my Didonia again. And so that was the whole reason for the project. And then, of course, as time went on, it became an urgent warning to all of us, unfortunately. So I wanted to get the story out. And I read somewhere that Kevin Costner was fighting to get Dances with Wolves made. Every film is a miracle that gets made. And so they had a strategy of making a book to help the film get made. And I thought, okay, well, I will, work with Rek to get this book made. And maybe that is my path to get the movie finally made. But ironically, the movie went faster than the book, and it was actually easier in some ways because illustrations are intensive, and the film had a lot more collaborators bringing all of their brilliant minds to this project. So it was like being a roller coaster of creativity, and just seeing how people would take your screenplay and bring their own spirit to it in the most beautiful, exciting way. And that was its own adventure, where the graphic novel was, could you please delete James Norton's cheekbones from this? Like, I don't, we're trying to make a project that's different from the film now. Like, because James Norton's classic cheekbones kept appearing throughout the pages. I was like, I don't know if I have the rights to James Norton's cheekbones, so you have to delete those. And plus, it was lonelier. I think one thing that filmmaking taught me, as somebody that I always thought of myself as a control freak, I love collaboration. I love the creative process, and just having a tiny few collaborators on the graphic novel felt lonelier compared to the messy, crazy, loud family of filmmaking.
And on that note, you had mentioned collaborators, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the process in which you worked with Ivan Rodriguez, who is the artist that you commissioned. How did you work together in order to establish a vision of the story and a characterization of Jones and the other historical figures?
Yeah, well, so all the years I was developing Gareth Jones as a film, I was chasing after all my artist friends, many visual artist friends, to read the screenplay. And they all came back with brilliant edits and just expanded my mind into the visual arts. So I was very early working with a friend initially on the graphic novel. He went through some life changes and dropped out of the project, and the publisher had to scramble to find someone else. With Rek's donation to get the graphic novel made, we storyboarded it initially with the new artist we hired, and then the publisher had a very specific vision. The publisher at the time was Carl Reed, who was part of the team that won an Oscar for a short film called Hair Love, about a Black father who learns to do his daughter's hair. Carl Reed had a very specific vision for the graphic novel. He wanted it to feel more Superman. He wanted Gareth to feel like a real life superhero. So that's how the look came out. And so Ivan came into the project to take the storyboard, to take the film, to take the sort of vision and bring it all to life. And because he has that Marvel comic book flavor, that spirit that infuses the work throughout. And he did a brilliant job, and it was really exciting to see. And I think that's an important vision that whole team created, because they could have, like Gareth's niece, Serial, said to me one time, who are you going to get to play Gareth Jones? Gareth was ugly. And I'm like, and I don't agree with that. Gareth was always my imaginary boyfriend all those years. He was like my ideal, my mentor. Like I would talk to him throughout all those lonely years of trying to get the projects off the ground. And so I thought Gareth is like the best. Like, no, but he could have been quirkier. Like his graphics, comics, do all sorts of things. For instance, I'm working on a new project, and the editor, and it's based on a real life person, and I don't want to give too much away, but the editor, so the real life person that it's based on is historically a beautiful woman, but the editor said, I want her a bit ugly. And I'm like, but that's not historically accurate. But the thing is, media, comics especially, are saturated with beautiful, unrealistic, beautiful women. So I understood the direction she was going, and it worked out fine. And with Gareth, we could have done the same thing. Like, here's this quirky, kind of awkward hipster. And we didn't. And we went with like a physical superhero depiction. And I think it works really well, because one of the motivations the great Agnieszka Holland had with making this project was that she was tired of anti-heroes. Like, we had decades of King, Martin Scorsese of Hollywood, glamorizing all these gangsters. And then, Agnieszka was doing House of Cards, and everything was so dark with these anti-heroes. Like, Breaking Bad was the big show at the time. And so it's no surprise that the world now has like Putin and a corruption crisis in so many countries, because we've been glamorizing these horrible people, these criminals. And so Agnieszka very deliberately wanted to bring a classic Hollywood hero to life, to model to people what it means to be a good person. And when the film rolled out, she was doing all these press interviews, she kept saying, Gareth has an empathy gene. And I think that just explains the world today. Some people have the empathy gene, some people don't. That's what it all comes down to. And she's absolutely correct. I want to just add, like, one of my projects that I'm working on next is on Dorothy Thompson, the American British journalist who won the war against the Nazis on the home front. And she wrote a piece that went viral she wrote an article for Harper's in 1941 that went viral in 2016 for reasons I'll let you figure out. And in that article, it's called Who Goes Nazi? And she writes about how to tell in your next dinner party by looking around the room who among you would become a Nazi if given the chance. And she ends the article by saying, I know how to play this game because I watched it happen in my beloved Austria, and I watched it happen in my beloved Germany. She was famous for Hitler expelling her from the country when he became dictator because of a hilarious profile she wrote of him. I think the Gareth Jones story is just a reminder that some people are just wired to care for others and our collective good. And Gareth had that.
I'm so fascinated by how Holland wanted to depict him as a hero, because he does come off as a superhero in this graphic novel too. He looks like Clark Kent in some ways, and I think on some level we recognize that, even subliminally. I wanted to return to something that you said a little bit earlier about how you sent out earlier versions of this graphic narrative to some colleagues and friends. Who did you imagine to be the ultimate reader or viewer of this text, and what did you most want to communicate to this imagined reader that you maybe had in your head as you were composing?
I wanted to reach kids, and I think with TikTok especially today, they're getting a lot more complex information. And I've met a lot of young people, we're talking 8, 9 years old, who are experts on World War II and the causes of World War II. So I think this new group of kids coming up that have been exposed to so much with social media, I think they're ready for books like this. I also wanted to preserve, like I said, the project was for my grandfather, but as I went through it, I was understanding how important it was on so many other levels as well, because we're living in a time of rampant disinformation and journalism jobs disappearing, newsrooms shrinking. To be a classic journalist, I don't know if future generations will know what that means because of how social media and AI is destroying newsrooms and the information we get and the overload, and how dictators like Putin leverage that power to cause further chaos and mass destruction. And so I wanted to show young people today that there's this thing called journalism and it's classic and it's essential. And this is what it means to be a true journalist. If you are practicing real journalism, it's dangerous, it's lonely, it's high risk. You have to be ready to be betrayed and misunderstood, but it's all going to pay off because what you're ultimately doing is leaving behind an invaluable record, and the truth will always prevail.
And as you're depicting journalism and Jones's own career as a journalist, I was struck by the way that you structured the narrative so that in the beginning, as in the slides that you shared with us, takes place mostly in Moscow, and it's only in the very center of the narrative that Jones actually goes to Ukraine. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you structured the narrative itself, perhaps how you worked with Rodriguez in doing so as well.
It was more about following the film because I launched this project with Rek before there was a film. And one of the many motivations was the sense of relief that whatever Agnieszka did to my script, at least there would be an audience that could read my screenplay as I intended it. It's very hard to work on a script that long and then give it away to others to do what they want with it. But that's what I had to do. And I was very heartened that she and I had some brain chemistry together, that we were like mind meld, and that her final vision was very close to what I had given her. But it was nice to have a graphic novel out there that is the shooting script, that has deleted scenes from the film that we couldn't fit into 2 hours, or the film would have been 3 hours. And so, and also her genius from her decision that she made on set obviously shaped, and as well as the actors, Vanessa Kirby and James Norton and Peter Sarsgaard, they all, even the actor that played Eugene Lyons of UPI, they all shaped the script. We had a very democratic set where the best ideas won. We had, thanks to the Temerty Foundation, that were our executive producers that saved the project. They had no script notes. They had no script notes other than go get them. And we did. And that's the best way to be. I don't understand these financiers that think, well, I have a ton of money, so that automatically makes me an artist or creative. It's like, no. It's like you need the artist to make art. And so I basically had a screenplay and I gave it to Ivan and I said, do what you want to do. Here's some storyboards that we did. Just make sure it doesn't look like the actors. And that's all. And like, he just had his way with it. And the editors came in and I came in, and a wonderful friend in Copenhagen, who is a comics editor for a beautiful, esteemed publisher there. I forget the name. He met with me over Skype for 4 hours, going through the panels, finding things that I just do not have the training to see. And so that was a massive education in how comics work. The shadows, the lines, oh my gosh, like it's just such a science even.
And I think that this is what a lot of people don't appreciate until they actually look at how comics are created and the long process and all the collaboration also, as you note. I'd like to call attention to one really interesting sequence in the course of the narrative. And this is a sequence that's without words. And it really had a strong effect on me. And this is when Jones was finding himself totally alone in the Ukrainian countryside. It's page 69 to 71 in the graphic novel. And maybe if we could look at these pages, two significant events occur here. First, Jones comes face to face with a wolf. And then second, he finds a barn that resembles the one in a photograph he carries of his mother. And as you said, decades prior, she had worked as a tutor in the Ukrainian city of Yusivka, now Donetsk. And both of these events are totally wordless. They demand that we look closely at the images and also pay attention to how Jones is himself looking at this new environment. Could you comment further on the visual significance of the sequence? Why might it be important that it's wordless? And what might be the symbolic significance of the wolf and also of the barn?
Yes, in the screenplay, there was a barn that we see in the very start of the script. We see it at the very start of the film. We don't see, well, we do see it at the start of the graphic novel. So we're always in the screenplay, there was this, I wrote this idea of like, we're headed towards a barn. Ultimately, the story is going to take us to a mysterious barn. What is this barn? And the barn represents mom in Ukraine, the beating heart of why Gareth is there. And the wolf is the lone wolf. And I'm so glad, thanks to Anne Applebaum, that I confirmed that there were wolves and Ukraine during that time, because it's these little historical facts that you always need to confirm. And so Gareth passes another lone wolf, and just a reminder of you're doing what you need to be doing. And then he comes across the barn shortly after that, and he discovers mom. The barn is mom, and he holds up the picture he has of mom. In the first panel there, he's holding up the photo of mom. He lowers it to reveal the barn. And inside the barn, he makes a discovery. And that's a very disturbing discovery. And he meets these kids who are orphaned by the famine, and it's heartbreaking. And that's one of the most indelible scenes of the film. I'm so glad I kept this scene in the film, because now Ukrainians on social media are creating videos where they hold up photos to show what parts of Ukraine used to look like, and then they lower them to shock the audience with, now this is destroyed now. And it's just, again, history repeating. This is probably my favorite in all of the book and the film. This is inspired by a trip to Ukraine in 2015, where some friends took me to their dacha, which is just a cow tethered to a tree in a field. And it was in Poltava. And at night, in the middle of Ukraine at that time in 2015, you could just see a blanket of stars in the sky. It looked like a giant whale was passing over you. It just, the whole sky looked gray, silver belly of the whale with all those stars. And I'd never seen a sky like that in my entire life. And I remember thinking, this is what the sky looked like during the Holodomor, when they felt abandoned by the world. At least they could look up to the stars and have God. You know, there's sort of like this cathedral light of nature is still with them, keeping them company in these horrible, final hours. And that sky made it into the film, made it into the book. And I kept telling the illustrator, more sky, more stars. It needs to be very brilliant. And he did the best he could to make it look realistic. We show Gareth in hiding from the wolves, from up in the tree and eating bark to keep himself going, because I obviously the real Gareth Jones, he victims of the famine would share what they had with him. He had his own bread and things, and eating bark became a sort of a composite character, a symbol of what these people had left in the world, nature. And he leaves a piece of bark for Durante at the end of the story, like, put this next to your Pulitzer. This is all the people have left to eat.
I'm glad that you mentioned Durante, because my next question was actually about him. Two important characters in this narrative are the real life Walter Durante, the New York Times journalist who infamously denied the famine in Ukraine, and his protege, Ada Brooks, who's a fictional character. Mm-hmm. So how does the inclusion of these two figures give readers insight into Gareth Jones's investigation of Holodomor?
So Walter Durante was the social ringleader. Whatever he said was the gospel. He was nicknamed our man in Moscow. And Ada Brooks represented initially my frustration as a young woman in the industry, a very misogynistic industry. This is before Harvey Weinstein got caught. She was sort of like this no nonsense, fast talking young woman that could see through Durante's nonsense and tips off Gareth in her own way. Vanessa Kirby came on the project. She and Agnieszka Holland had a different vision for Ada Brooks, where that they wanted Ada Brooks to represent the heartache, the struggle of the true believer, because Agnieszka, who was born in Soviet-occupied Poland, knew those people extremely well. They're in her family, they're in her friendship circles, people that couldn't let go of the dream of the Soviet Union, and they couldn't see the nightmare in front of their faces. And so they wanted Ada to be that struggle. And so I rewrote Ada to be more struggling with, Gareth says to her, open your eyes. Like, do you think these people are a human sacrifice for what? And that was the big debate that was going on for generations among the liberal intelligentsia. And because so many so-called liberals and good and well-intentioned people who were shaping opinion in the West, including the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, the Webbs, which founded the London School of Economics and were hugely influential. Of Aldous Huxley, no, there was another one. Was a whole long list of useful idiots. It was the Gareth, and because of them holding on to this, the ends justify the means. You can't, as Durante would always say, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. You're not going to create the workers' paradise without killing millions of people to build it. It was these fashionable voices across the media that forced Gareth and Orwell to be isolated, to basically really stick their necks out and look, risk looking crazy, risk their very careers, in Gareth's case, his life.
And what strikes me, especially in some of those early sequences, is just these lavish lives that these reporters were living and these Westerners were living, even as people were starving in Ukraine. So I have so many more questions, but I'd like to open this up to our audience. I'm sure that many of our audience members have questions for you as well. We have a question here. The graphic novel opens as a story within a story of Orwell writing Animal Farm with Eugene Lyon's apology book lying on his desk. And so much of this narrative refers to stories, journalistic stories, truth-telling stories, denial stories, etc. Why do you open your graphic novel this way, with a story within the story?
Because of what I just said about Orwell and Gareth. And Orwell himself risked his life. He was almost hunted down and killed by Stalinists fighting in the Spanish Civil War. And so was his wife. They're on their honeymoon there fighting fascism. And Orwell's big book in Spain, Homage to Catalonia, was the first to really expose what Stalin was doing in Spain. So I think for me, it was this feeling of the truth tellers trying to find each other across space and time and piecing together the truth that way and ensuring the truth prevails. And I felt a lot of kinship with that. Orwell literally did that. I went to the Orwell archives. I dug through them. George Orwell shared a literary agent with Gareth Jones. They're roughly the same age. They were both friends with Malcolm Muggeridge, who was another voice that spoke out against the famine. And eventually, not at first, but eventually, Malcolm Muggeridge published a piece about it in the Manchester Guardian, but didn't put his name on it. And Gareth Jones put his name on it. And that's significant. I wanted to show that. And I wanted to show the very big point of that opening as well, as I want the Gareth Jones graphic novel and the film to be a gateway for readers to go look up Assignment in Utopia, read the chapter where Eugene Lyons describes the crime against journalism of what they did to Gareth. And that's why I put it there. Like you don't believe me? Go find these primary sources. And because there's because that book, Assignment in Utopia, that Eugene Lyons writes, that confession, Orwell goes on to write a book review of it that is so damning and talks about the famine, and it describes the Stalinist empire in a way that sounds like Putin's Russia today. And so Orwell knew from reviewing that book, he knew what they did to Gareth Jones. He knew, because it was being done to him. It was being done to him. He was so determined to fight back against that and to carry on Gareth's legacy, like not for Gareth Jones, but for the sake of truth. And so Orwell writes an essay called The Freedom of the Press, calling all this out, saying it is so fashionable to be in the pocket of Russia. And he wanted that essay, The Freedom of the Press, to be the preface for Animal Farm, a book he could barely get published. He lost a major publishing deal because of a British man in the Ministry of Information working for the Soviets. And so Animal Farm couldn't get published. And so finally, a small independent press agreed to put out some copies. They waited until the war was over so they wouldn't upset Uncle Joe. And they said, no, we're not going to put that Freedom of the Press essay, that angry essay you wrote, as the book is, you don't need it anyway. But the existence of that essay is the story of Gareth Jones.
Thank you. We have kind of a comment and a question. Excellent companion to the movie. Congratulations on this book, which should be in
Thank you.
every library. Could you please give us some info on where to purchase it?
Yes. So thank you so much, Oksana. I appreciate that. You can purchase it wherever you get your books. So Simon and Schuster has a website. So if you Google "In the Shadow of Stalin," the story of Mr. Jones, you can find the Simon and Schuster link. Try bookshop.org. If you don't want to give money to Jeff Bezos at Amazon, you could try bookshop.org. I haven't checked yet if it's there, but I hope it is because I love that site. And then I encourage everyone to buy a copy for yourself, for the young people in your life, and to donate them to your local library.
Well, I'll keep that in mind and I'll certainly be teaching it in the future.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to talk to your class if you ever want to.
Excellent. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I have another question that was sent to me. The pages that you read mentioned Metro Vickers being in Moscow. What is the Metro Vickers story?
Yes. So Metro Vickers was, and apologies for not explaining that. I wanted to sort of jump right into the discussion portion. Metro Vickers was a powerhouse British firm that was making lots of money, helping Stalin rapidly modernize the Soviet Empire through his 5-year plans. The Brits had officially recognized the Soviet Union, which was a very big deal. The Soviet Union, of course, had been largely considered a pariah state for how the Bolsheviks brutally murdered the Tsar and so many elites. And plus, the Marxism aspect terrified the capitalist West. And so the fact that the British saw an opportunity there and they sent their engineers for Metro Vickers, they got the party started to make money over there. These engineers, at the height of the famine, when Gareth Jones was doing what he did, when he was out in Ukraine, when rumors were just flying about what was really going on, those journalists, Durante, Eugene Lyons, they knew. They were famine refugees starving in the streets of Moscow. That's how far they made it out. They all knew things were getting very hot for the Kremlin. They even paid a visit to Durante's apartment. When Gareth was on his big adventure, they took hostage the 6 engineers, British engineers, working for Metro Vickers. Huge, shocking story. The big sensation in the West, and you can see newsreels to this day exist about this story. That's how big it was. That there was going to be war with London and Moscow now. This could only mean war. And that, of course, was the shiny object distraction for what was happening to Ukrainians. But who cares about them? They're only Russians. That's what Durante would tell everyone. They're only Russians. Who cares?
And this sounds so similar to discourse that's happening today as well.
100%.
So a colleague has messaged me a question saying, in addition to producing this graphic narrative, you have played a major public role, especially as the co-host of the podcast Gaslit Nation, exposing Russian neo-fascism, Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, and Russian meddling in recent Western elections. How does your graphic novel, which depicts an earlier era in Eastern European history, give readers more insight into the more contemporary issues that you address in your podcast?
It's way too on the nose. I almost think I'm living in a simulation, but I have to remind myself that history doesn't change because human nature doesn't change. When the graphic novel was coming out, it's very strange what happened, but it's the DOJ, the Department of Justice, announced sweeping indictments against a Russian disinformation operation headquartered in Canada with a shell company in Canada. This operation was paying famous MAGA Trump influencers hundreds of thousands of dollars to spread Kremlin disinformation against Ukraine, including one of them by the name of Tim Pool, who used to be seen as a credible journalist for Reuters back in the day. But now he was on the Kremlin payroll. And he knew when $400,000 appears in your bank account in 1 month, $400,000, you know who's putting the money there. I don't know too many people, with media dying, we're in the worst year of media layoffs since the 2008 global crash. And you're getting $400,000 in 1 month to spread Kremlin disinformation against Ukraine. and turn Americans against Ukraine, to weaken our support, to give MAGA politicians cover for denying Ukraine aid and saying Zelensky has to surrender, Zelensky has to fire his brilliant US ambassador to Ukraine, and on it goes, right? What I always say on Gaslit Nation, if it sounds like a paid Kremlin shill, it's a paid Kremlin shill. Because I know from Mr. Jones, that the people that sounded like they were on the Kremlin payroll were on the Kremlin payroll. Duranty lived a luxurious life, and he had all sorts of fame and power and influence. And it was because of his access to the regime. Stalin granted him 2 sit-down interviews, which was extremely rare, and that made him famous.
Yes, and sadly, just very recent events within the past few days place this into starker relief. And I'd like to thank you again for this fascinating presentation and this wonderful conversation. I very much urge all of our viewers to pick up this graphic narrative if you haven't already. So thank you again, Andrea Chalupa, most especially for joining us and sharing your creative process with us. I'd like to thank our web techs, Claire Peters and Grant Wong, for the amazing job that you do. And thanks to Sofia Isayo for organizing and coordinating these webinars.
Thank you, Sophia.
So once again, I'd like to extend our thanks to Andrea Chalupa for her novel In the Shadow of Stalin, The Story of Mr. Jones, and for talking with us today. Congratulations for this fabulous job. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
And thank you also to everyone who's joined us tonight. For additional information about the Holodomor and to view all the REC Education webinar recordings, please visit the REC Education website. That's education.holodomor.ca. There are plenty of resources and teaching materials for classroom use there. If you don't have it already, please download our annual pamphlet that is full of links and information and can be used for Holodomor Memorial Day in schools, which is on the 22nd of November this year, or the 4th Friday in November. If you're looking for a text to help teach the Holodomor, you will see information about Valentina Coreliu's recent published book, The Historian's Craft Lesson on Human Rights and the Holodomor. Please also consider applying for the annual REC Educator Award for Holodomor lesson plan development. The application downloads from the website, and the deadline to apply is May 1st, 2025. As you know, and as our speaker has reminded us, Russia's war on Ukraine continues now into its 31st month. We see that the Kremlin's genocidal intentions for Ukraine and its people remain the same as they were in the 1930s during the Holodomor. They were openly proclaimed by Putin even before the invasion of Ukraine, in which he stated his aims to eradicate Ukrainian identity and Ukraine as a state and a country. The Russian war on Ukraine today demonstrates the relevance of studying the Holodomor to better understand current events. We are grateful to all the authors who have spoken to us in our webinars and who continue writing novels about the Holodomor, for your creativity and skills, and for bringing awareness of it to today's youth. Thank you and good night. Slava Ukraini.